Before we kick off the show, if you're a fan of History Hack, please do what you can to support the show. We completely get that not everyone is able or willing to dig into their pockets. Times are hard, but by dropping a like, subscribing on Twitter and YouTube, and importantly, leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts, you can help the programme grow and reach more people. If you're interested in becoming a supporter, go to patreon.com/historyhack, where you'll find perks from secret Facebook groups to early release material. If you just want to leave us a one-off tip, go to ko-fi.com/historyhack. The links are in the description. And whatever form your kind support takes, know that we are massively grateful. Enjoy the show.
Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. I am so beyond excited today because it is one of my most interesting subjects. Not quite my subject, but we're going to go down that road. Alex, tell us who we've got today.
So we let you come out to play for a Holocaust episode because we're talking about Italy. So we're welcoming back Christian Jennings, who is a British writer, freelance foreign correspondent, and the author of 8 works of non-fiction. He writes all over the place, and he's done episodes with us before. He has books on the Gothic line, Flashpoint Trieste, the First Battle of the Cold War, Syndrome K, How Italy Resisted the Final Solution. So we are going to talk about Italy and the Holocaust today. Christian, welcome.
Thanks very much, guys.
It's been a while. How are you doing?
Hanging in there, keeping going, been keeping busy writing another book, this time changing slightly from mainstream Italian World War II history to how Italy resisted the final solution. So a cross between Italian World War II history and the Holocaust.
We always talk about the Nuremberg laws in Germany in 1930s. But we don't talk about anything else. We don't talk about what happened in Hungary with the racial laws, and especially Italy. And I'm assuming most of our listeners have no idea that there were racial laws in Italy itself.
Up until 1938, and my book, Syndrome K, whose title I'll explain in due course, follows the story of 2 or 3 Italian families in Rome and Turin, who in 2 cases, there were families who were firm supporters of Mussolini's fascist party. Ettore Ovazza, a rich banker in Turin, was an absolute committed fascist. He wrote to Mussolini all the time saying how great he was. The Italian Jews were both socially incredibly well assimilated into Italian society over hundreds of years. And at a political level, the Italian Jews made up some of the main component parts of Mussolini's government, his government ministries, the army, the head of the Air Force, his financial supporters. And so while the Germans were clamping down legally and physically upon their Jewish population in the 1930s, the Italians were not following suit. Mussolini didn't want to follow Hitler's persecution of the Jews because he looked down upon the way in which the Germans were treating their Jewish population, and Mussolini could see exactly what was coming. And Mussolini also knew which side his bread was buttered on. He knew where his money was coming from, who his political supporters were, and he saw no need to do it. There was nothing kind of disturbing, the Italian empire, the Italian government, that could be improved by a persecution of the Jews. However, this changed in 1938, where in my book there's a teenage boy who comes to school and is told, as of tomorrow, you can no longer go to school. You can't take your exams here. You and your sisters have become non-people. You don't exist. And the same happened with a teenage girl, Virginia Montalcini, at a high school in Turin. She was in the same year, the same class as the writer Primo Levi. And they were told, along with the other Italian Jewish children in the school, no more school for you. You can't take your exams. You have ceased to be part of the social, racial, or professional system here. From that point onwards, what happened to the Jews of Italy? It was not deportation to concentration camps, violence, death. They were interned in a whole series of internment camps, former army barracks, schools, hospitals, government buildings across Italy, many of them in the south of Italy, where Jews from the north of Italy would be taken, where the conditions range from fairly arduous to quite acceptable. Nobody was being killed at this point. And the implementation of the Holocaust and the final solution in Italy only began when the Germans occupied the country after the July 1943 armistice. When the Germans occupied Italy in August, September 1943 was when it first began.
How does Mussolini's government respond to the Holocaust? Is the story that you'd expect of fascists supporting fascists?
It wasn't before 1943. After 1943 it was, because after 1943, if the Germans said jump, Mussolini answered how high. They were his only chance of survival. And the fascists who remained with Mussolini's residual government in the north of Italy after the German occupation of the country in autumn 1943 were avowed anti-Semites, most of them. And Mussolini was determined to do whatever the Germans wanted to keep his allies on side. Up until then, up until summer 1943, before the Italians had changed sides, Italy had, curious enough, become a country of refuge for Jews fleeing Austria, Germany, Poland, Hungary, and other places like that. The Jewish population of Italy in the beginning of 1942, when the Wannsee Conference convened by Reinhard Heydrich from the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin established the concept of the final solution. Adolf Eichmann estimated that there are approximately between 52 and 55,000 Jews in Italy. In fact, the full number was about 45,000. A lot of them managed to escape, firstly to Italian-occupied areas in France and Croatia, where in fact the Italian army would often hide the Jews. For instance, this happened quite often in Croatia. The Jews of Italy could also find it easier to get visas from Western embassies in Rome to emigrate to the United States and to South American countries as well. And their story of the Italian Jews before 1943 was one of escape and evasion. After the Germans arrived, it became one of fight and flight.
Do you know, we're going to come up to this question, and everybody comes up with this question one way or another, comes up from conspiracy theories and all sorts of crazy people bring up the Vatican. So I'm going to bring it up, not because I'm a crazy conspiracy theorist, because I'm actually genuinely interested in this. So what was the Vatican's response to all of this? Because they are pretty much stuck in a very awkward position, being surrounded by Mussolini's fascist Italy at this point, aren't they?
The Vatican were in a very tricky position because Mussolini's relationship with the Vatican was one of Italian dealing with Italian. I mean, it was partly due to the laws that he had passed at the Vatican City. Itself had been recognized as independent territory in 1929. It was. And Mussolini knew very, very well that the Vatican's hold, the Catholic Church's hold on the loyalty of most Italians was far stronger than fascism. So Mussolini wanted the Vatican where they were. The Vatican's stance about the increasing persecution of the Jews in Europe was to speak out about it in subtle undertones. Pius XII's policy was essentially to say relatively little and try and do behind the scenes as much as possible. And he's been blamed for doing too little, for saying nothing, for not protesting about the deportation of Jews from Rome in October 1943. But if you look, both through looking at signals and information sent by the Vatican, statements made by the Vatican, the absolute vast volume of archive material that's available from the Vatican archives, if you piece it all together with what the Germans were saying, the Swiss were saying, the Italians were saying, the British were saying, you see that the Pope was essentially assisting from about 1938 the anti-Hitler resistance. Secondly, he knew very, very, very strongly, once the final solution began in Europe, in Holland, for instance. At one point, he made a particular protest about the detention, deportation to Auschwitz-Birkenau of 200 Dutch Catholics, which prompted the SS in the Netherlands to whisk them off to the concentration camp system. And the Pope told his private secretary, who noted it down in the diary she kept every day of the Pope's sort of statements, his feeling is that if this is what happens when he protests about 200 people, what would happen if he protested about 2 or 4 million people? He was balancing the effects of what he might say with what action would actually result from it. And he knew by 1943 that when the Germans arrived in Italy, that the Jews of Italy would be in their sights. As early as 41 and 42, he'd been transferring money from the Vatican Bank. In 1942, had assets of around $2 billion, the same as any major industrial country. The Pope began transferring this money across to banks across Italy, enabling the properties of the Vatican that it owned in Italy, the thousands of churches, convents, palazzos, houses, apartments, to be put at the disposal of hiding Jews if and when the time came. The second thing is the Pope knew that if he spoke out in, for instance, in Italy against what was happening to the Jews, the enormous persecution of non-Jewish Poles, for instance, could turn from being a persecution of people who were persecuted simply because they were Polish to because they were Catholics. And Poland particularly had a huge Catholic population. And the Pope saw and wrote it down, and his Cardinal Secretary of State wrote it down as well. He saw a direct link between how he criticized the Germans and what might actually happen to Catholics in Europe. And the Catholic Church and the Vatican in many ways didn't help themselves, because they didn't try to be understood, and they didn't make their position clear. But behind the scenes, the more you investigate the links between the American and British diplomats based inside the Vatican, the more you look at the code breaking between the Vatican's codes, Bletchley Park, the Germans, the Swiss, the Red Cross, the more it becomes apparent that the Vatican were doing an awful lot behind the scenes, but very little up front. And as a result, the Pope himself has received a lot of criticism about this. He also, he had a very, very, very weak papal nuncio, his ambassador, his representative in Germany, Cardinal Orsenigo, who was an apologist for the Nazis and refused to protest on, quite often on 3 different occasions that I tracked down. The Pope actually said to him, you have to find out what is happening about the news of the final solution in 1943 or 1944. And this cardinal in Berlin simply either fudged the issue or refused. The answer to your question is the Pope was a much criticised, but unfairly so, head of an institution that did a huge amount of work behind the scenes, but not enough up front to be able to redeem its own image.
What was life like in Italy for Jews trying to evade arrest?
Hiding, escape, evasion, changing your name, getting a new identity card. The family that I looked at, who were a family of middle-class, prosperous textile traders from central Rome, this before 1943, realized that to hide, you had to trade. Italy was a very, very, very well documented, very bureaucratic country under fascism. It was a country of informers, delatori, as they're known in Italian. People sneaked and spied on each other to the fascist regime. And Jews became very, very, very visible. So life for them became one of hiding, firstly, they tried to escape to South America, which meant getting visas. The Vatican helped arrange a visa program with Brazil, for instance, to the United States, but the Americans were very, very, very slow and loath to change their very limited refugee visa quota system annually to go anywhere near helping Europe's Jews. They hid in Croatia. They hid in Italian-occupied southern France, Sardinia, Sicily, Corsica. Italian families and the Italian population at a very general level helped hide Jews, helped conceal them, helped falsify their identities, and huge amounts of money started coming from the Jewish Refugee Distribution Committee and other Jewish aid groups in the United States and Switzerland, channeled via Switzerland to the Catholic Church and Jewish groups inside Italy, enabling Jews to get false identities and to hide. Prior to the Germans' arrival, it was about hiding and trying to escape. After the Germans arrived, it was taking refuge in farms, houses, homes, attics, convents, where you just simply hid. It was a kind of Anne Frank style existence for many of the Jews of Italy from autumn 43 to when the Allies progressively liberated Italy from Rome northwards from June 44 onwards.
So my question is this where Syndrome K comes in? So tell us what it actually was.
Syndrome K was after the first roundup of Italian Jews was on October the 16th, 1943, when Adolf Eichmann, who'd been tasked by Ernst Kaltenbrunner in Berlin with spearheading the final solution in Rome. Eichmann took an SS Einsatzkommando into Rome, and his first operation was to try and surround and round up the Italian Jews from the capital's old Jewish ghetto, which sits just on one side of the Tiber, not far from the Vatican. There are approximately 10,000 Jews living in this tightly knit network of streets and houses. The SS surrounded it at dawn, and despite this, 9,000 of Rome's Jews out of 10,000 something escaped. The Germans deported just over 1,000 to Auschwitz on the 18th of October, leaving a huge number of Italian Jews in Rome trying to find places of refuge. Across the River Tiber on an island from the old Jewish ghetto stood and stands today, I went there the other day, the Fate Bene Fratelli Hospital. It was established in 1585 and was part of the Order of St. John, the Hospitality of God, and an ancient Roman medieval order, and was theoretically neutral territory. And to this hospital, Jewish families and Jewish individuals would cross, taking refuge. And there at the hospital, the director, Giovanni Borromeo, and one of the doctors, Adriano Ossicini, came up with a plan they would hide Jewish individuals and Jewish families within the hospital by putting them in closed wards and asking them to feign the symptoms of a completely fictitious respiratory disease, a highly infectious respiratory disease, which sounds very familiar to all of us in the pandemic nowadays. But the Jews were asked to feign the symptoms of tuberculosis. And Italian doctors decided to name this mysterious disease Syndrome K. K for Koch's bacillus, which was tuberculosis, but also K from Albert Kesselring, the German high commander in Italy, and Herbert Kappler, the head of the Gestapo in Rome. And what they did with hiding these Jewish individuals and Jewish families disguised as patients in the hospital is they had to enter into the hospital's log that these Jewish families were actually ill with something. So they just they made up a disease and called it Syndrome K that was just completely fictitious. And Adriano Ossicini, the doctor who claims to have invented the name for it, said that when the German search parties turned up, it didn't take them very long to be put off and disrupted and to disappear, because, as he said, the Germans were neither very, very clever nor very, very brave. So once they sort of found out there was a highly infectious disease doing the rounds, they left the hospital.
It's brilliant. How is Bletchley Park involved in this? It's genius. It's in connection with what you call the Holocaust codes. What are they?
What I call the Holocaust codes, for want of a better technical kind of overview title in my book. Bletchley Park was involved in the tracking of the implementation of the final solution in Italy, because Bletchley had, from about the time of the beginning of Operation Barbarossa onwards, June the 22nd, 1941, Bletchley Park had begun to intercept, well, Bletchley didn't intercept, their intercepting outstations at places like Bow Manor Hall in Leicestershire intercepted the messages. They began to intercept and decrypt at Bletchley large numbers of radio messages coming from the SS and the German police on the Eastern Front, which were detailing mass executions of large numbers of Jews. Churchill included this in one of his speeches in November 1941. And as a result, the head of the SS police on the Eastern Front actually made instructions that the SS and German police should change from just radio messages to either handheld code books or using far more doubly encrypted Enigma messages. A complicated way of saying that the British had started cracking what the Germans were doing in the final solution. By April 1942, Bletchley Park had begun to decrypt intercepts that were coming from the same places at the same time every day in the same format, in the same code. The code was called Orange. The code breakers of Bletchley Park gave nicknames based upon fruit to SS codes: grape, grapefruit, quince, pear. Orange 1 was the SS codes from inside the concentration camp system. And at first Bletchley didn't know what they were, because they were just columns of numbers. And they were the same every day. At the beginning of every day and the end of the day, they would intercept the same messages, just rows and rows of figures. Then they realized what these actually were, which was they were the different numbers of arrivals, departing, and it was the prisoner inmate vital statistics, as Bletchley called it, of approximately 10 camps within the concentration camp system, predominantly within Auschwitz, Dachau, Mauthausen, Sachsenhausen and Neuengamme, not in the extermination camps in Poland. And Bletchley cracked this by a piece of extraordinary luck. The columns of figures were all laid out in X thousand people arrived on a given day. The number of what the SS called departed, which meant died, were gassed, escaped, were shot, died from disease, was the next figure. So with the existing camp population, plus the new arrivals, minus those who died, gave the number of inmates in each camp every single day. The Germans were very thorough. They were very Teutonic. They reported everything all the time about everything within the concentration camp system. And when you read these messages, it's the micro detail of the commandants wanting to report everything up the chain of command, not to be caught out, not to be found wanting, not to be criticized. And Bletchley saw that at the end of every day, the number of inmates in the camp, say 10,000 in camp X, obviously at 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, that number was also going to be the same as at the beginning of the following day. The SS used the same number of the existing camp population at the end of the day, the existing camp population at the beginning of next day, in subsequent days' messages, even though they changed their coding systems. So Bletchley had a crib to break into, a numerical crib. And then they realized they weren't looking at words, they were looking at just lists of figures. And then it started to make sense. And then they realized that these messages were all coming from all the same places, all with lists of figures, day after day after day after day. And then they began to be able to crack a whole message system around them. And I called these the Holocaust codes, which were, I've read quite a lot of them. There are a certain amount of them available. There are an awful lot of them, I think, been burnt, destroyed, lost. The camps themselves destroyed, a lot of them. But they give a picture of the daily ebb and flow of life, but predominantly death within Germany's concentration camp system. There's everything from, guards committing suicide, typhus epidemics, the lack of people to guard the camps because they've all gone on leave or fled or run away, SS guards who can't be trusted with weapons, the fear of rebellion within the camps, not enough food, a lot of German thoroughness about logistics and details and numbers, how to bring enough food from here to there. Wasn't it terrible that 80-year-old men labouring in a quarry in Mauthausen weren't physically fit enough to lift huge lumps of rock? The logistics of reporting that Camp X had produced 2 tons of human hair. What was the best thing to do with it that would most assist the war effort? It's the logistics of mass death that you're reading in these messages that Bletchley cracked. And the difficulty with the Holocaust Code was that the more and more Bletchley knew about it, it was getting the Allied infrastructure to know about it and then to be able to do something about it. But bringing it back to Italy, what it meant was that by October 1943, when Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Heydrich's successor, the head of the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin, who was overseeing the final solution, not just in Italy, but everywhere else, when he was giving orders to Herbert Kappler, the head of the Gestapo in Rome, and to Adolf Eichmann about what to do about the final solution in Italy, the messages they were sending from Berlin to Rome and getting from Berlin back to Rome, the Allies were reading the whole lot of them almost in real time because they'd been cracking them for about a year. So the Allies passed these messages to the Swiss and to their diplomats in the Vatican as well. They in turn informed the whole Vatican infrastructure. So there was a certain, and the Germans were trying to get consensus among themselves for the implementation of the Holocaust in Italy. The German foreign ministry thought Italian Jews could still be just detained as laborers and used in places to build camps, or just taken to work in factories. It was the SS who wanted to exterminate them. And so there are a lot of messages backwards and forwards between the foreign ministry in Berlin, the head of the SS in Berlin, Himmler, and the Allies could read these and saw what was coming. And basically there was a certain amount of forewarning based upon this. And the Holocaust codes, as I call them, my writing about them touches the tip of a huge and very horrible iceberg in this book, and there's more about it in my next book, but was also backed up by the communications that all sides were sending every single day. The Vatican's codes, their simplest ones were relatively easy to decrypt, but contained nothing of importance, whereas their very, very important messages went in, a code called KIC Green, which the Americans and the British hardly broke into at all. And the Holocaust codes were the unseen electronic signals, heartbeat of the German administration of the final solution. And against the human stories of how the Holocaust proceeded in Italy and how Italians helped Jews resist it and escape from it, you have the backdrop, which is the whole electronic communications of what was going on in the Holocaust.
So let's move on to the idea to basically what the Jews were doing in Italy and talk about the Jewish Partisans. Tell us a little bit about them.
The Jews had a variety of options. A lot of them went to hide in convents, Catholic churches. I follow in my book the progress of one family who went to hide in a Swedish convent in the middle of Rome. Some Jews ended up fighting with Italian partisan groups, for instance, in the town of Casale Monferrato, which is a beautiful town in between Turin and Milan in northwestern Italy. The son of the rabbi in this from the old Jewish synagogue in Casale Monferrato joined Augusto Segre, joined a local partisan group, which was made up of a lot of Jews, and fought against the Germans in and around Turin. And as the German occupation of Italy progressed, the Germans occupied in August, September, October 43. The Allies invaded in summer 43. It became a slogging match as the Allies moved slowly up Italy and the Germans retreated. Behind the ever-decreasing German front line, the Germans were carrying out their operations to arrest and deport Jews. Partisan groups, particularly those which had Jewish members, were trying to make this as hard as possible. And what they tried to do was they saw that when Jews were arrested, they were detained in detention centers in Genoa, Turin, around Milan, and in 3 other detention centers across the north of Italy. And the partisans saw that if they could try and disrupt road transport between the main cities, and in any cases, if they could disrupt railway transport, then the Germans might be able to round up Jews, but they wouldn't be able to get them out of the country. And getting Jewish deportation convoys out of the country to Auschwitz and Mauthausen, the latter in Austria, the former, obviously, as you all know, in southern Poland, meant that trains had to go up to northeastern Italy, go across the Alps, either through the Brenner Pass or curve around the far end north of Trieste and go to cross Austria. And there are an awful lot of railway lines, and the partisans did their best to try and disrupt the railway infrastructure and slow down the German deportation of the Jews. What the partisans actually achieved best in slowing down the process of the Holocaust in Italy was to be able to arrest and deport Jews in other countries in occupied Europe where the Holocaust was being carried out. The Germans had been successful of this because they had invaded the country first, forcibly pacified it, and then arrested people. In Italy, they were trying to fight a war against the Allies on the front line, against the partisans behind the front line. There was no logistical stability or security for them to carry out their arrest operations of Jews at all. The other thing is they couldn't differentiate Italian Jews from any other Italians at all. The majority of the Germans in Italy had never been outside of Germany before. They certainly didn't speak Italian. They certainly had no idea what these people looked like. And the other thing is that the Jews in Italy were helped by catastrophic German incompetence. I mean, everybody has this idea that the final solution was a sort of ruthless piece of flawless Teutonic planning in exterminating part of the human race. Yes, to a certain extent it was, but the cogs in the machine that carried it out were human German cogs, and human German cogs from the SS, who far too often were interested in looting, plundering, enriching themselves, and less in actually deporting Jews. And one of the shortcomings the Germans in Italy, the SS particularly, and you see this again in the decrypted messages between Berlin and Rome, looting gold in Rome and transferring it back to Berlin occupies a huge amount of message time for the Germans. Where is that 50 kilos of gold? Which station has it arrived at? You said it would arrive tomorrow. We haven't got it yet. We need it. They were robbing countries blind, the SS. It was part of their economic enrichment program. The other thing is that of the senior SS officers and Gestapo officers in Italy implementing the final solution, a substantial number of them at any given point were Allied double agents. And as the war's end got closer and closer, this just simply increased. And the number of, I would say 9 or 10 of the senior SS figures in Italy, in Genoa, Turin, Milan, Verona, Rome, Bologna, either were or went on to be Allied agents during or after the war. And I focus in my book of one particular officer called SS Lieutenant Guido Zimmer, who was based in Genoa and Milan. His job was stealing property from Jews and putting them on trains to Mauthausen. He did a lot of stealing their property. He didn't put too many of them on trains because he was running a separate scheme where he would take bribes off them to let them escape. He was also working with the Americans to try and bring about an early peace in northern Italy, so-called Operation Sunrise. He was also working with Italian partisans to make sure that his business schemes weren't discovered. And like a lot of these Germans, he was catastrophically stupid. He kept a diary, he wrote all of this down, and he saw which way the war was going, and he thought he may end up testifying in court against his former colleagues. So he wrote down every single thing he did. And his diary from in late 43 to 1945 is just a litany of conspiracy, duplicity, lying, cheating, theft amongst the SS in northern Italy. In one case, this SS officer realizes that one of his main business informants and contacts has been arrested and is on a train to Mauthausen, arrested by other SS colleagues for being partly Jewish. And SS Lieutenant Zimmer takes a 250,000 lira bribe to be paid in gold or foreign currency from Italian colleagues of this man to get this person off the train to Mauthausen before he's executed at the end. And he sends signals furiously to each station along the line where this deportation train is going until it gets to Austria, saying, listen, guys, so-and-so's got to be taken off the train before it gets to Mauthausen. Terrible mistake. Please send him home. Because SS Lieutenant Guido Zimmer knows that if he doesn't get this person off the train, he's going to lose a huge amount of money. Personal enrichment schemes were very big with the Waffen-SS. And the other thing as well is that the German Wehrmacht, in some cases, hated what the SS were doing against Jews, as did, in 3 particular cases, the German diplomatic service. There's a plaque in Florence to Gerhard Wolff, who was the German consul in Florence in 1943 and 1944, who did a lot to help save Jews, despite, in the face of his fellow countrymen's operations to deport them.
Have to ask you, one of the chapters in your book is all about an SS double agent. Who were they and what impact did they have?
He was called SS Lieutenant Guido Zimmer, and his activities, which I've just described, of stealing money from Jews, taking bribes from them in return for not arresting and deporting them. At the same time, he was part of a network of SS officers who, from late 1944 onwards, were trying to negotiate a separate early peace in northern Italy with the American OSS. The Office of Strategic Services negotiated in Switzerland itself, and the kind of coterie of senior SS officers in Italy knew very, very, very well that they stood a very high chance of being chased down for war crimes after the war. So saw operating as agents for the Allies as a way to escape prosecution and probable hanging.
The final question, while I'm taking a very deep breath, what were things like post-war? I mean, the Jewish community, were they able to rebuild their lives in Italy? And the last and final question, just to add another one into the mix, is what about the reprisals against the fascist collaborators?
Reprisals against fascist collaborators, there were a lot of them in the immediate aftermath of the war. Particularly by partisan groups, as the partisan groups, both on the left and the right of the political spectrum, allied with and became part of political parties. They took a lot of revenge on collaborators, and the scenario for Jews in Italy after the war was. A lot of them, in my book about Trieste, I write about returning Jewish families who come home. They had they came home to a kind of wrecked, destroyed, exhausted, impoverished country. And a lot of them had a very, very hard time persuading people about what had happened in the Holocaust and this was partly Primo Levi's problem, was that he couldn't persuade people back home in Italy about what he'd actually seen. In 1945, the number of people who had actually seen what was happening inside concentration camps had predominantly been killed. Yes, a lot of American soldiers and British soldiers and Russian soldiers had liberated the concentration camp system. But the world had seen newsreels and photographs, but the Italian Jews returning home found it very hard to persuade their fellow countrymen about what they'd seen in many cases. And the other thing that happened for a lot of Italian Jews was that huge numbers of them emigrated to Israel. And Italy itself, particularly the ports on the eastern Adriatic coast of Bari, Ancona, and Trieste, became points where Jews would board boats to take them illegally, deemed by the British, legally by everybody else, to take them to Israel. And Jews, again in the book, there's stuff about Jewish soldiers in the British Army who, when the war finishes, help set up a network of children's camps with Jewish refugee survivors of concentration camps in Poland, Ukraine, Germany, and Austria. And they take these children off to Israel.
Christian, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. That was incredibly enlightening. You know me, always ready for a Holocaust podcast. But do you know what? I really desperately need to grab a copy of your book, physical copy of your book, and read up a little bit more, because some of it for me has been new, some of it not so new. But you're always willing to, for me anyway, I just want to add that. But it will be very interesting to find out a little bit more and especially read more about the Pope, because I found that incredibly interesting. So thank you so much for joining us.
When our guests join us to talk about their work and their new book, the 45 minutes or so they spend with us is just a taster of all their efforts. So to this end, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest and greatest books. You can support them, and you can support History Hack too. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep at it and bring you more amazing guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/history hack, or just search on bookshop.org for us under the shops bit. Thank you for your continued support, and here's to your next great book.